Excellent. Okay, so for years, the energy transition was discussed as a shift that would happen in steady, predictable increments. But a massive surge in electricity demand in recent years, now colliding with a fracturing geopolitical landscape, has reshaped the global race for clean, reliable power. So much so that the head of the International Energy Agency recently declared, "We are in the midst of the largest energy security crisis the world has ever faced." And I believe this will reshape investment strategies globally, with parallels to the major changes the energy world witnessed after the oil shocks in the 1970s. He continued, "We are already seeing intensified efforts by both producer and consumer countries to diversify trade, routes, and energy sources." The IEA's recent report suggests that nuclear power is entering a period of renewed growth and strategic importance after decades of stagnation. It would be fair to say that nuclear energy has been pulled back to the center of the national conversation, with many policymakers from all political persuasions calling for a nuclear renaissance or perhaps revolution. But, and it is an important but, past multi-billion dollar, pound, euro cost overruns on traditional gigawatt-scale projects still hang over the sector, even as a novel pipeline of small modular reactors and other advanced nuclear technologies promise to reshape the grid. One novel delivery mechanism is that of a floating nuclear power plant, a product, as opposed to a project. A product that delivers reliable, firm, clean electricity, and that is what we will now focus upon. So to help us understand the opportunity and materiality and size of the prize, we will now turn to our esteemed panel. The format of the event will be that each of the panel will make a presentation, and then afterwards we will have a Q&A session. I've got some questions from Slido, but please, we will be engaging with you as well. So, Andrew, over to Mr. Rystad.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone. I'm excited to shift the conversation to the commercial opportunity. And to do that, I'm going to talk about the market forces and really the energy system problems that we believe structurally underpin the opportunity for floating nuclear power plants, and how floating nuclear power plants have the opportunity to solve these problems by delivering firm, clean, affordable power and supporting energy sovereignty. The first underlying driver that I'll discuss is power demand. But we've entered a new era of power demand growth. Over the next 15 years, we project that power demand globally will grow 60% faster than we've seen over the previous 15 years. And of course, we're all familiar with the data center story. And data centers are driving surging demand in some parts of the world right now. But this demand growth in the next 15 years is actually broad-based. A lot of this demand is coming from the transportation sectors, as a higher share of global fleets are propelled by electric vehicles. It's also driven simply by increased deployment of air conditioning, deployment of heat pumps, and industrial growth. And not only is this demand broad-based from a sector perspective, it's also broad-based geographically. If you look at the right side, you can see that over the past 15 years, China was over 60% of global electricity demand growth. Well, China won't play as outsized of a role in the next 15 years. So this demand growth is both sectorally broad-based and geographically dispersed. And this is a real problem for governments and industry to solve. And as government and industry are thinking about this problem, we like to apply frameworks for this decision-making of what generation sources are needed. And here we present this energy need hierarchy. And at the base of the pyramid is reliability. And reliability has been front and center over the past few years with the cutoff of Russian gas supply to Europe, with the blackout in the Iberian Peninsula, and most recently with countries in Southeast Asia curtailing economic activity, limiting the workday or limiting the number of days in the office because gas and fuel shipments are stuck behind the Strait of Hormuz. Reliability is the most important energy need. And after that, we need affordability. High power prices in Europe have led to deindustrialization, made some industries no longer competitive on the global stage. And electricity prices for consumers have been rising faster than household incomes in much of the world. So after reliability and affordability, countries need to secure sustainability and sovereignty. And the relative importance or focus on these varies. There's a bit of a pendulum effect. Right now in the US, sovereignty is certainly front of mind. And that means onshoring manufacturing of components. That means securing the nuclear fuel supply chain, for example, a directive that the US administration has enacted. And that means making sure that fuel isn't trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz. And these are all problems that floating nuclear power plants have the opportunity to solve. Of course, nuclear is one of the most reliable forms of energy. Of course, it is sustainable. Reducing dependence on regular shipments of fuel helps support energy sovereignty. And the move from large-scale mega projects to modular, timely products supports affordability. And what about the role of renewable energy in this mix? We all know that solar is one of the cheapest forms of power in the world. And I am very bullish on the future of solar energy globally, but there are challenges with variable renewables as penetration in markets increases. So here we're looking at capture rates in various European markets over time. The capture rate is the revenue realization as a share of average wholesale prices. And you can see when we look at solar, seasonally in some markets, solar is only capturing 50% of wholesale prices. This means that the next megawatt of solar generation is more expensive than the previous. And this is in addition to other system costs, like the need for firming these resources and the need for building out transmission to peak generation. Now, solar will continue to grow, batteries will help, but it cannot solve the entirety of our energy problems in the future. And with this backdrop of surging power demand and the fact that we need firm generation, we see governments around the world putting meaningful support behind nuclear energy. If you look on the left side here, we're showing government funding awarded for nuclear development over the past few years. In the US, nuclear enjoys wide bipartisan support. There's support for conventional nuclear, support for SMRs, support for advanced reactors, and support for the fuel supply chain, in addition to things like faster licensing. In the UK, it has been called the golden age of nuclear, and there's government support behind Rolls-Royce SMR commercialization. And this extends across the Western world and across countries in the East. And it's not just governments that are supporting nuclear energy, it's also industry. And right now, the industry that is most visible are the hyperscalers. Hyperscalers are putting real money behind nuclear development because they need the power, they need firm power, they need clean power. And so they're supporting nuclear through investment and through offtake. Other companies like Dow. Dow is supporting SMR development in Texas. And so with this backdrop of the challenge of surging broad-based power demand growth, the need for clean, affordable, reliable, secure energy, and the fact that renewables cannot bring all of those attributes, we project a very large market opportunity for floating nuclear power plants in the future. We believe that by 2040, the opportunity for floating nuclear power plants, the total addressable market, is over 1,000 deployments globally. And this is based on power demand growth, baseload demand growth. It's based on retirement of baseload generation, and it's based on analysis of demand and infrastructure proximal to coastlines. So the market opportunity is there. The problems for the energy system are there. Floating nuclear power plants can be part of the solution and capture part of this market opportunity. Now it's really time to execute, to deliver, and to build the fleet. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So good afternoon. I'm Hannah Vickers. I'm going to speak to you just about the market opportunity in the UK market. And I have a confession, I'm the first person I think today to be speaking with a sausage dog notebook, so we're going old school. I'm going to start with a little bit of market context here. So I'm really optimistic about the opportunities for FNPPs in the UK market out to 2040. And I'm going to, over the next few slides, make the case for why that is. Start with a little bit of context here. We have a huge need for clean energy generation in the UK. So on the 2nd of June, so just a couple of weeks ago, our man there, Ed, stood up in Parliament and he set the 7th carbon budget. Now, don't believe this is just about carbon. He did this because we have to, with our legally binding climate target, set a climate limit. But the reasons he gave for enshrining this in law, meaning that we had to do it, was to protect bill payers from rising energy costs. That was both domestic but also industrial bill payers. He also talked about it driving growth and industrialisation and the importance of industrial strategy in the energy transition. And lastly, he talked about it meeting the global climate goals. So in something that was titled the 7th carbon budget, actually, carbon came third in the priority list. But what it does mean is that actually, as a country, all of our planning decisions, all of our infrastructure decisions, things like Heathrow expansion can only go ahead if we sit within this 7th carbon budget. And the reason this is important context for us is this graph on the right. So the yellow bars are energy generation, and these are the legally binding carbon limits that we have to adhere to now. So regardless of which government we get, regardless of the political rhetoric, we have to adhere to this. And what the yellow bars are showing us is that we need to make dramatic cuts in the carbon emissions from our energy generation. So there is government policy that sets out how we're going to do this. But the reason I'm really optimistic about the opportunities for us is because I believe we're actually entering a period of a significant renewable delivery gap. So we just had some brilliant context around what that looks like globally. I think we have an acute issue with this in the UK. So up on screen, and I'm loving the size of this screen, by the way, because it really helps when you're into data as much as I am. Feel free to take photos. These are all government numbers, which I enjoy because it's the best way to lobby government is to put their own numbers back at them. So this is an extract from the UK government's 2030 clean energy targets. And it shows you the rather ambitious rate at which we are going to be building out our renewables in order to deliver that. So you can see up here we've got 350% increase in offshore wind, 200% increase in onshore wind, 300% increase in solar, and actually more sort of 4 or 5 times increase in battery storage. All of that from 2023 to 2030. Now, even if we get close to those unprecedented levels of build-out, we have got some economic challenges around that because we'll have done all the easy, cheap sites already in our renewable build-out. We're now hitting the more challenging economic sites. And there's evidence to support this as well. So if we were to go back to 2023, there was an auction round 5 for offshore wind where the government set the strike price too low and nobody bid. 0 bids, nothing. No renewable energy projects coming forward in that, even though there was a government subsidy. Because actually what we're doing is getting into the more challenging economic situations where we're needing to put these sites. So even if we could technically build this out, economically, it's not going to go back to what we were aiming for with the 7th carbon budget announcements a couple of weeks ago of bringing bill payers' bills down. So based on this evidence, I do think we have got a significant risk that we will not meet our clean energy targets in 2030. I mean, I am very happy to take a bet on that, if anybody would like to take a bet on that in the break. I think we're probably going to be pretty far off by 2050. So that, when we come to look at 2040, means that we are going to have a shortfall. But when we look at the numbers and we look at our nuclear generation at the moment, it really brings it home, I think. So just to put this in perspective, our current nuclear generation capacity is 6.1 gigawatts. That's what we have today, around 6 gigawatts. If we fast forward out to 2040, because we've got the brilliant programme now of the Rolls-Royce SMRs, we've got the gigawatt facilities coming online, hopefully, if they get built on time, that's going to take us up to 10. If we build out, still do really, really sort of ambitious build out on the renewables, but only half the rate, bearing in mind some of these are 350%, so that's still doubling our build out rate than we've ever done before. If we do half of that, we're still going to have a shortfall of 90 gigawatts, and we are planning for 10 of nuclear. So I think somewhere between 10 and 90 means that we have got a significant market opportunity here for FNPPs. And it's only really when you look at it in that perspective that you get over the hurdle of thinking there is a need here. So the question then turns to actually, how can we deploy into the market? And unfortunately, my lovely colleagues are sat in the way of a brilliant quote because we have got, this is NESO, so this is the government's energy systems operator. They obviously have to adhere to government policy, but they have put this beautiful quote, which does, pretty much admit that the current government policy out to 2030 pushes the boundaries of what is feasibly deliverable, which I think is civil servants speak for, not a cat in hell's chance of us making it. Okay, so I'm not going to wax lyrical about FNPs because we've heard enough about them today, but they do provide flexible, firm, low-carbon power. And actually what I would like to focus on are how that is going to meet the grid and industrial needs. So we've made the macro case, but what does it look like in practice for us to try and deploy these into the UK market? So some of the regulation and things around the UK market is quite interesting. We, in effect, have 2 routes to market for FNPPs. So, to fill our big sort of 90 gigawatt gap, we have got routes, having a fleet of these supplying electricity into the grid. So what that means is that, in effect, we would be able to cover some of that shortfall in renewables, but we'd also be able to start to pick up doing it at scale and realising some of those industrial strategy benefits. So, particularly touching on what we just heard about with some of the shipyards. I think that probably will come later. I actually think some of our first deployments might be private wire. So I think this is really, really interesting because actually what you've got here is the ability to be able to offer faster access
to organizations like data centers. You can share in the economic value, and I'll show you a slide later, which is what I mean by that. And it also gives them longer term price certainty. So if you're an energy intensive user, so if I'm thinking about renewing my steel mill, I want to know I've got long-term price certainty for the duration of the business case for that investment. That'll be 20 or 30 years. I don't want a shock after 15 years that I can't afford my energy and my whole plant becomes unaffordable, and I end up with a stranded asset. So actually there are some really interesting profiles where it really benefits organisations to have a private wire agreement with us. But surely it's too difficult to build in the UK. I get asked this one, and I'm sure someone's going to ask it. Ask it in the Q&A. Isn't it too difficult to build in the UK? Well, it is challenging, but we are very British, and we do like a bit of self-flagellation about this. And there are a couple of reasons here why I think we can be optimistic. So the first of the Fingleton reforms, the Nuclear Regulation Bill. What that means is that actually the regulator has a focus on outcomes. So they need to be taking decisions that are going to help drive economic growth, help bring down energy prices, but also take risk-based decisions. So I'm going to do a show of hands. Anybody in here heard about the fish disco? Yeah, there we go. So now you've got something to talk to each other about at coffee, but there will be no more fish discos under this regulatory regime. Secondly, the Advanced Nuclear Framework. So this is an indication that the UK government is interested in bringing forward broader technologies. So you guess, whilst maritime nuclear is currently excluded, and I think we could challenge that, actually, the Advanced Nuclear Framework is the government sticking its hand up and saying, we are interested, we are keen to sponsor, bring wider nuclear technologies to us, to the market here. So I think, again, that's really positive news for us. And finally, it's too expensive. Obviously, it's too expensive in the UK. I think we're going to come on to this in the questions, but just a couple of things, and I think it touches perhaps on some of what we were talking about in the shipyard conversation. If we zoom out and think about the opportunity we have here in order to be able to support our customers, look at their whole value chain. On the right, you'll see 30 to 40% of the cost to an end user could be avoided by a private wire connection. That avoids taxes, that avoids costs around suppliers of energy. So there's a big change there. If you think I'm operating my data center and you can offer me potentially something which is in the region of 30 to 40% cheaper, I might be quite happy to pay a little bit more. If we then look across to the left, I talk about zooming out and thinking about the client value chain. If we can unlock unpowered land for a data center, where you're paying a premium for powered land at the moment that has a grid connection, that fundamentally changes the business case of the overall project. So again, what we're starting to do here is move up the client's value chain, which may be that ultimately we can charge a bit more for our services, but overall it changes the dynamic in terms of the, whether or not things can go ahead. So just to conclude, we talked a lot today about some of the enablers, and undoubtedly regulation, government sponsorship does have a role to play in enabling these FNPPs to come to market. But I wanted to end on a positive, because I think these organisations here are some of the examples of the forward-thinking, I call them main characters, that we should be working with when we think about this, because in a previous life I was a Treasury civil servant, and the best way to enable and support development and bringing these sorts of things to market is to develop partnerships with these kind of forward-thinking organisations and come as a consortium, come as an alliance and say, look, do you or do you not want Vantage data centres to be expanding in the UK? In which case, you buy us as a package and you help support us and you help support the creation of the ecosystem that means that we can bring FNPPs to market in the UK. Okay, thanks.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. So I'm Boniface de Champris, working for the Computer and Communications Industry Association, which represents a broad cross-section of technology companies, including some of the leading AI developers, deployers, and also the large hyperscalers. So I'm here today to bring you the tech perspective, and I will focus mainly on data centers. As we've seen, the tech industry is a massive consumer of energy, but also a massive investor in energy sources, including nuclear. And we are very excited about building the floating nuclear market by 2040. Currently, we are locked into a global race for leadership in AI development and deployment, and the European Union has very clearly indicated that in order to even take part in this race, we need over the next 5 to 7 years to triple our data center capacity in Europe. It's not just about building more infrastructure. It's really a massive investment that is needed. It's very capital intensive, and it is needed for everything that we are currently using and will continue to use. AI requires a lot of energy. Not only for development, but also for during use for inference. So this is very important. However, what we currently observe in Europe is that our digital ambitions are colliding directly with an outdated energy grid. Onshore grids in Europe are old, severely congested, and getting a new high voltage grid connection can take years, which is highly problematic. At the same time, the Eurostat data clearly illustrates that non-household electricity prices in Europe remain volatile and structurally high compared to global competitors. And this is, of course, further accentuated by the current geopolitical environment, which has consequences on the prices in the European Union. So if we do not solve this roadblock and this major issue, we will see a digital flight. We will see tech companies moving to more favorable jurisdictions, and Europe will most likely miss out on its the digital goals and ambition. I think a recent example in the UK that is very telling about the importance of energy and prices was the recent decision of OpenAI to roll back its Stargate project in the UK, which was a massive commitment and investment in data center capacity in the UK, citing prohibitive energy costs alongside regulation, copyright regulation. But energy was really a key part of this decision. So what do we need, or what does the tech industry need? There are 4, I would say, non-negotiable criteria. We need energy sources that are immediately available to match our needs. So energy needs to be immediately available. Second, it needs to be abundant. We need massive gigawatt scale power deployed rapidly to match the exponential growth of AI and to power data centers. Third, data centers operate 24/7, 365 days a year, so we need continuous supply, which means that variable, weather-dependent, renewable energy cannot satisfy our needs on a standalone basis without massive investments in storage capacity, which are also very, very costly. Which brings us to maritime, nuclear, and floating power plants, which are a perfect operational fit. Sorry. Yeah. So if we look at this projection, which is quite interesting, you will see that data center demand is rapidly shifting away from legacy hubs in Central Europe to Northern and Southern Europe. Power demand is projected to scale up to 5 times in the Nordics, and we see significant growth also in the Mediterranean area. Interestingly, this fits the location of the demand, mirrors the exact location of early FNPP pilots. As you are aware, there are currently pilot projects and studies on floating plants in Greece and enabling nuclear shipping infrastructure in major ports like Rotterdam. So our infrastructure needs head exactly towards the more maritime energy solutions that are currently being designed. I will talk a little bit about regulation, because to unlock this commercial synergy, we need the rules to be technology neutral. This is very fundamental. This means that the European Commission, which is currently finalizing mandatory sustainability rating requirements for data centers, need to ensure that the renewable energy factor that will be included in this rating system also includes nuclear alongside any other carbon-free technology. This is really fundamental. If we maintain a technology-neutral framework, it will unlock massive corporate pipeline for corporate power purchase agreements, which will be also very relevant for maritime nuclear deployments. So what does this mean if we look at 2040? Data centers require essentially 3 core inputs: land, massive industrial cooling capacity, and clean power. Ports and coastal industrial clusters are already being actively considered for data centers and for advanced deployment of these data centers, including due to ocean cooling efficiencies. We've seen that the port of Sines in Portugal is currently the seat of an AI data center developed by Smart Campus. And we are seeing many other projects outside of Europe. I'm thinking of California, Stockholm, Singapore, only to mention a few. So by co-locating modular floating nuclear reactors right next to these coastal digital hubs that are emerging, we can partly solve the problem of grid congestion for data centers. So to conclude, the FNPP market has a great potential to satisfy the need and scalable demands, as well as the sustainability mandates that the tech sector has. And we are ready to be an anchor tenant in this market and to ensure that the concept reaches repeatable scale by 2040. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, panelists. And you respected your timescales exceedingly well. So there is much time for questions, and there's a lot of rich content there, yeah? You know, we covered the globe, we covered the UK, we covered Europe. So I will kick off the questions, but please do put any questions you have on Slido, or alternatively, we will be using the roving mics as well. So let me ask one question to each of the panelists, yeah? So I guess this one is directed to Andrew. So from a global perspective, so which markets are you envisaging to be the first movers? Yeah. What is it that, you know, what are the characteristics of the markets that in your research led you to think that these would be the most suitable, convenient locations?
So the age-old saying is that the first FNPP is the hardest. And when I think about the most promising initial entry market, I think of the United States. And the US, I think, is a great petri dish with the right environment to have the first FNPPs. It also has a lot of scale for continued deployment and growth. We've talked today about the bipartisan support, mature regulatory environment. There's also surging power demand growth in the US. Utilities are struggling to meet this demand, especially struggling for the firm generation. You can see that reflected in recent US capacity market auctions. You also have industry that is hungry for power. Of course, the hyperscalers, they want power now. They are investing in nuclear. You also have a vast amount of coastal industry in the United States. And then with first deployments in the United States, I think that we should expect costs to slide down the learning curve and certainly make it easier to open up global opportunities elsewhere. And places like even Indonesia and Malaysia are currently major LNG exporters. And one day, they're likely to become major LNG importers. So they have a power system problem that needs a solution, and FNPPs could be part of that solution.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, question for Hannah. So land-based nuclear has a history of cost and schedule overruns, and in fact, many projects in the UK and other countries, whether it be tunnels, railways, runways, there seems to be a challenge with projects. Now, given your time in the government and also in the private sector, can you provide a little bit of commentary about that, and therefore how you see the shipyard modularization approach being a key differentiator to not having to continue that legacy of project overruns?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Can I just start saying, sometimes we do get it right.
Well, the London Olympics, we delivered on time.
Oh, no, but that was about 10 times over budget, so we don't
Okay.
that one anymore. No.
On time.
No, we can talk about Thames Tideway. We now have Sir Andy Mitchell, so that's fine. That's the one at the moment. So in terms of actually what makes a difference around getting us to land on time and on budget. So one of my other roles is I'm a member of the Construction Leadership Council in the UK, and we did do quite a lot of modelling around this just to look at what the productivity opportunities are. 17% of the productivity opportunity, i.e. you can do it 17% faster and cheaper with everything that you do before you get to site. So that is sorting the planning regime, that is actually organising the supply chain and setting up things like the shipyard ecosystem we were talking about earlier. That is thinking about, perhaps we're probably going to get less regulatory challenge and certainly less local challenge if we have these offshore, if we have these in industrial areas. So, the other one, big one in that is funding and financing, and we can obviously have a very different funding and financing conversation when you've got these products than when you've got a big, solid, in one place infrastructure asset. So actually the dynamics of the way that we're developing and bringing FNPPs to market really starts to unlock that 17%. And that's before you go anywhere near the comparison with what happens when you actually get on a construction site. So when you get on a construction site and you compare that to what you might be able to do in a modular approach in a shipyard, away from the site, away from the weather and the other challenges, you'll get another 7% on top of that. So, we're starting to get up towards 25% cheaper, 25% faster. That will come to bear in the economics, but I do think more importantly, in the context of where we are with the energy generation challenges, that's going to hit us on the time. We should be faster, certainly at scaling these, than we would ever be at trying to build, any number of gigawatt plants in the UK.
Okay, thank you, Anne. And a question for you, Boniface. So, in the European Union, electrification is a central part of reaching goals on energy security, competitiveness, affordability, and emissions reduction. Are you and your members seeing much evidence of this? There are many examples of regrettable deindustrialization taking place in Europe because of decisions made. But are you and your members seeing active, tangible support to capture that market that you shared with the audience?
I think we would like to see much more action and realization from the European Union of how important this is. I would add it's also very important for the EU's competitiveness at large. Beyond industrialization, all business sectors in Europe and arguably globally will need to use AI, advanced AI, which requires data centers that are not too far away to for the speed required to infer all the data. So we really need more data centers. We need better access to the grid, and we need more energy. I think currently it's very fragmented in Europe, and the EU needs to take more decisive action.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think within my member companies, people working on power purchase agreements have very important work and a workload that is that is considerable, and yes, what is needed is also to have a timely access to energy sources.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Boniface. Right, let's turn to the floor. And if there are any questions, I would ask you to please state your name and your affiliation and a short question. Is there any? There's a question down to the left. Thanks.
Thank you. It's Tim Stone. I was on the panel earlier this morning. A question for Hannah. Apart from Andy's great work in Tideway, Rob Holden delivered HS1 on budget and slightly early, and Abu Dhabi built their nukes pretty much on time and budget. So we can do it. But the critical issue for me here is, what do you think the real scale of true need is in the UK? Because the rising demand for energy is getting worse and worse by the minute. We have everything that's low carbon operated today has to be replaced by 2050. The only sizable B still remains. So the sheer scale strikes me as vast. Can you comment on a bit more on that, do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess I kind of refer back to some of the stats that I had in the presentation. I think, we're not going to hit the 2030 clean energy targets. We're absolutely not going to. NISO has pretty much come out and said that. I think what could be interesting is how the political climate changes over the next few years. But I still think, regardless of the colour of the government that we might get in, say they might land, 2029 in the next election, even if somebody wanted to repeal what we've got in terms of the carbon budget, that will take them another 2 years to do that. So, we've sort of got 4 years here to really prove the case and get some of this away, because when it gets beyond the point of being, a hypothetical, something that we could do, that the economics look great on paper, when we actually get some clients putting in these power purchase agreements and pulling, I think, the demand for FNPPs forward, we've got 4 years to do that in the UK, because at that point, the realisation will happen in the country at large that we're miles off the 2030 targets, and we will be in a conversation about how much of that 90 gigawatt shortfall by 2040 we could be picking up with a fleet of FNPPs, and that's what I think we've got to aim for. So there is going to be that shortfall. It will be somewhere between 10 and 90 gigawatts by 2040. I would, again, very happily take a bet on that. Because there's just no way we will be able to build out the renewables at the pace that we need to. I guess the question is, what can we do by that point to position ourselves here and FNPPs as the solution to it? Because I have no doubt at all that the need is going to be there.
Excellent. A question at the front, and it's my boss, so I better say yes.
I have a question for Andrew. This crisis in the Middle East with the closing of the Straits of Hormuz has led governments all over the world to recognize that sort of the security of supply of LNG in particular is or has become unreliable. And current global production is about 600 billion tons. We have another 700 billion tons in projects. A lot of them have been cancelled because they weren't seen as being economical. But now I think I was in Singapore last week and spoke to the government there, and they're thinking very, very differently about this now. We see the same thing reflected in all over the world. They're thinking, we're going to have to find different ways of supplying this. So looking at what we can do quickly. And of course, projects that are either on the shelf or being planned and then are being canned, are being brought back to market. Now, if a large portion of LNG projects were being brought back, you could see a collapse in LNG prices, and we can have a repeat of what happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where cheap gas basically undermines pretty much all other development of novel things that are coming forward. You guys are one of the leading energy research houses in the world. What are you seeing on the other side of this? Because there's a lot of competition for meeting this demand. And of course, nuclear has that long-term sustainability promise, but that focus on short-term supply and the short-term security that you can get from existing fossil fuels is there. What would a massive expansion in LNG capacity over the next, say, 10 years do to the rest of the industry that's looking to meet this demand?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer certainly is different for each country. But if we look at Southeast Asia, which is the region that has been most exposed to the loss of Qatar's supply from the Strait, Southeast Asia, many countries will probably delay the retirement of coal, kick the can down the road, and delay the sustainability problem. And they might actually, gas turbines are very expensive. They also, some of them are not able to build the turbines. So I think there really is a kicking the can down the road effect here. There's a fallback to reliability. Another interesting dynamic that the crisis has highlighted, I believe, is looking at how resilient China has been to the disruption. And especially if you look at the oil side, China has dramatically curbed imports of oil. And one of the ways they've been able to do that is strategic investment in electric vehicles. Over half of EVs sold in China are electric vehicles, and that has reduced the nation's dependency on oil from the Strait. And so that's another long-term policy implication, I believe, is that countries will realize that liquid fuel supplies are very exposed to the Strait, and EVs allow another path toward energy sovereignty.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And sorry, is there, oh, over there, please. Virginia.
Thank you. Thank you. Virginia Crosby from NEMO. Hannah, great presentation, all of you actually, but particularly Hannah. My question relates to you.
I didn't pay her to say that.
You can pay me later. My question relates to existing UK. What's the single most important change that the UK government can make to enable private finance into the FNPP market here in the UK?
I think it would be to put it through something like the ANF. I think to give that government sponsorship and say, and when I say sponsorship, it's not putting money in, but it's saying we recognise this, we are going to act as a concierge across government and help you with, the regulatory reforms. We're going to help you with the planning process. We're going to help you with siting assessments. We're going to tell you where the nuclear designated sites are. That kind of government has all of this sort of soft power to be able to sponsor and support FNPPs into the UK. And I'm really pleased that we have the ANF, because I see that as a starting point. The mechanisms there, all that we need to get them to do is to expand it to say, actually, that now includes maritime nuclear under that same umbrella, and that can be part of our pipeline. And I think seeing a credible pipeline come forward alongside all of the other different, nuclear technologies, I think would just give what we would need for the investors to then come in. I don't think it's a case of government guarantees, any of that kind of thing. I think that actually, particularly if we're going for private wire rather than wholesale markets, we could go there, but I don't think we would need to be honest, because we're financing a product.
Okay.
So there you go, Tim.
Yep, we've got a question down in the front. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So Stefan Pollitt from the MOD again. Apologies, I couldn't fit this on the Slido, so it's a little longer in terms of a question. It's actually timely following on from Virginia, given the panel that she was sat on earlier. It's a question around kind of messaging around some of the stuff that you guys have spoken about here. And it's around messaging of how you message to individuals and communities versus how you message to some of the hyperscalers and some of the people who will be running some of these larger companies, because it seems like the product pitch is sufficiently different for both of those. So for example, for a hyperscaler, you're pitching, oh yeah, by the way, we can go do a direct wire and then we can avoid some taxes, et cetera, and we can make it cheaper and more competitive. But if I'm in a local community, I will hear, okay, so there's a power station that you might be scared of, which like Robert was talking about earlier, that's powering a data center that you might not want. That is, oh, by the way, you don't get access to any of this energy. Oh, and by the way, they're exploiting a tax loophole, so you don't even get any of the benefit for it being here. So how do you pass those two things? And to Per's point earlier around kind of fueling on a separate point, where are you getting the material from? It's an incredibly constrained market. So certainly not expecting that second question to be answered in a pithy one-liner, but yeah, more on the first point.
Who would like to take a picture of that one?
I believe there was a gentleman on a panel earlier that would better be able to speak to this issue of community engagement. What we've seen from, for example, the renewable industry in the US is that it takes stakeholder management from the moment you are looking at the land to acquire, looking at the site. Certainly that will be important about keeping the community on board with any development. TerraPower in Wyoming, obviously it's not floating nuclear, but they've been very successful with their community. So it will be important to find the right communities and engage with them early.
Mm-hmm.
I think one build upon that, sorry, before you, Hannah, it is that given the novelty of our delivery mechanism, it is clearly additionality. It is additional electricity that we're supplying into grids, communities, what it is. So, there is no cannibalization taking place if core power comes along and works with the utility or a port or whatever. Yeah, it is new. Hannah?
So I was going to share a short story. A few years ago, I was involved with the geological disposal facility. So how not to do it would be to get the engineers to do the engagement targeting grannies outside supermarkets and telling them how they're living next to a nuclear waste dump. But what that does kind of lead on to is I think this needs to be pragmatic and multifaceted, and Copper are an excellent consultancy, by the way. If anybody is thinking about doing this, highly recommend them, who will do a much better job than I will in explaining this. But I think there is a piece around, you can get community benefits. We can speak about the jobs. There are now starting to get mechanisms where they can get cheaper energy by hosting a nuclear power plant. So some of these things around local benefits are starting to come through the system. But I think, the biggest thing we could probably do as a collective is be pragmatic in the messaging about this. The reason that we're in this pickle right now is because we haven't had a really decent joined up energy strategy in the UK for about the last 20, 30, 40 years. We just haven't had it because it's too big, too scary, too complicated for any individual government to tackle. And we're still going forward under that illusion that we're going to be fine with these 2030 targets. There is a massive shortfall. We are going to face brownouts. At what point do we start bringing that up in the social consciousness and say, look, you might not want a nuclear power station, but I'm sure you would like to access the internet and be able to turn on your TV, be able to charge your electric vehicle, more than being a little bit worried about having a floating nuclear power station just off the coast next to you. So I think we've got to start to bring some of that realization up in the public consciousness.
Yeah, I think is a necessity is the mother of invention, and you speak to some ports that are suffering brownouts or worse, and you speak to them about our proposition, and of course it's absolutely, why haven't we done this before? Why hasn't this concept been here before? Yeah? Any other questions? Oh, very good. The Admiral.
Because the Ministry of Defense asked the last question, and we're talking about community. And Hannah, I do want to just pile on and say it was brilliant. This is something that opened my eyes, and it's a U.S. story. It's not really a question, but something that really kind of surprised me in terms of messaging. And it addresses this emerging kind of resistance to data centers coming into communities. And the story is this, and I'll round off the numbers. and I'll anonymize it, but the number, I think you'll get the point. Small town in a rural United States of about 7,000 people. And they thought it would be a good economic boost to bring a data center or two into the town, right? And so they did all of those things that town governments do. They held a meeting, a town meeting. They put it on their website. They opened it up for public comment, et cetera. So the discussion is ongoing, engaging, just like as we've been advised to do. On the website, this small town of 7,000 people got 80,000 comments, about 90% of which were negative against building the data center inside the town. And when they did the analysis, 90% of those 80,000 comments were generated in Bangladesh, right? And so, there is a geopolitical dimension of this that we just want to make sure. I think it reinforces the point of local messaging even more, right? Because we've got to get into those communities, build up a sense of trust that we've got this and we've got your best interests in mind, because there are plenty of people out there that would love for the UK and the US and our allies to stop building data centers so that we could therefore, fall behind in this competition. So we just, another dimension that at least caught my attention, caught me by surprise, that this type of a thing is that sophisticated in terms of disinformation. So anyway, thanks.
Excellent. Final question then from Tim again. It's all happening in that corner.
Sorry, it's a bit like John's. This is a comment rather than a question. I was part of the consultation process for the siting process in the UK in last time we did it. And if you go to the communities which have existing nuclear power stations and you say, would you like a new one? You're basically chased out the room saying, how fast can you do it? I want it tomorrow. Why is it not here tomorrow? Getting the experience of those communities who've had nuclear power facilities nearby, which have produced careers and families and communities for 50, 60, 70 years, is a really good way of getting somebody else to tell the story, not someone like me or an engineer, heaven help us, to do that, because it's about people at the end of the day. As John said, it's very easy to massively distort what looks like public opinion. Talk to the real people, get the real people who've been there and get them to explain. And just since it was an MOD question, why don't we stick a couple of FNPPs at Faz Lane or a site or somewhere like that, and then use the spare power locally to help grow other industries in the neighbourhood.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. And just for this, if it's 15 seconds, yes, ma'am. Otherwise,
I think that Faz Lane and Rystad in Scotland, the feeling of the government against nuclear power is all the way through. And I think in terms of conversation on who we should change in this and who we should be talking to, we don't also look north of the border and how we can engage there. I think we're going to have serious and problems. Just shows how interesting I thought some of this conversation is within the UK.
Okay, thank you. So, and for the sake of balance, I will say that Andrew and Boniface, your presentations are very good as well. So everyone's satisfied there. And my final comment is going to be that earlier on, the Admiral referenced about nuclear pulling the enterprise forward, and that the strategic moment exists now. And I would advocate, so whether that enterprise be a country firming up its national security strategy, its national energy policy, or industrial plans, or a company ensuring it remains relevant and capturing competitive advantage, the transformative impact of FNPPs will be quite profound. So thank you to my panel. Thank you very much.